All right, I'm going to get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Lora Appleton. I'm the founder of the Female Design Council, and I'm so excited for this conversation tonight with our company and these incredible artists that are from the Epic Objects show, Objects 2020. We are going to have an amazing conversation, and I'm really excited to introduce you to everyone. Here with us this evening, we have artists Ashwini Bhat, Amber Cowan, and Luam Melake. And we're so thrilled to talk with you today about their work, their influences, and all of these, and their experience that got us here today. So thank you so much for joining. And let's get started. Ladies, if I call your name, please wave in case people aren't as familiar. And here we go. So I'll start with Ashwini. Ashwini is an artist born in southern India, currently lives and works in the Bay Area in California. She holds an MA degree in literature, and while her earlier career began in classical Indian dance, she now works in developing familiar forms to suggest complex interplay between the landscape, the human, and non-human. Ashwini was awarded a McKnight Foundation Residency Fellowship for 2021 and has been the recipient of the Howard Foundation Award for Sculpture. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally and can be seen in many museum collections. And as I mentioned, her work is also shown in Objects USA 2020. Welcome, Ashwini. Next up, we have Amber Cowan. Amber lives and works in Philadelphia, where she received an MFA in ceramics and glass from Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University. She was the recipient of the Rakow Commission from the Corning Museum of Glass in 2014, and her work can be found in the permanent collection of the Museum of Art and Design in New York, the Toledo Museum of Art, and the RISD Museum. Her sculptural glass work is based around the use of recycled, upcycled, and second life American pressed glass, and she uses the process of flame working, hot sculpting, and glass blowing to create large-scale sculptures that overwhelm the viewer with ornate abstraction and viral accrual. Her recent diorama-style pieces tell stories of self-discovery, escapism, and female loneliness. Next up, we have Luam Mulaki. Hi, Luam. Luam has a background in both architecture and design, and her studio practice includes hand-woven sculptures and furniture objects. Luam received her BA from the University of California, Berkeley, in interdisciplinary field studies, majoring in architecture with a minor in art history. Mulaki gives physical form to complex emotional themes by exploiting the psychological associations embedded in materials, while using structure and materials to explore the interdisciplinary relationship between art, design, craft, architecture, and industrial manufacturing. Welcome, ladies. I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you. So I'm gonna jump in. So for these first questions, I would love you all to answer. And if we could start with Luam. Luam, tell us what inspires your artistic vision and your identity as an artist.
Well, definitely an interdisciplinary approach to how I work. I tried a lot of things before I settled on, the language that I'm working in now. I knew I wanted to do something creative, but I wasn't exactly sure. So I basically have opened myself up to finding inspiration in a lot of different fields, and then taking what I want from each of those things and sort of merging them together. So that's really what has informed my approach generally.
Thank you. And what about you, Ashwini?
Poetry and nature both have been constant sources of inspiration for my work. I now share my life with an amazing poet, and some of my current work is in response to one of California's eco-poets, Brenda Hillman. I'm also working on a series of performance films, loosely based on poems of Akka Mahadevi, 12th century anti-establishment poet from Karnataka. That's my home state from south of India. The humility and the sense of time I feel every time I stand in front of a giant redwood tree continues to shape me as an artist.
Thank you so much. And what about you, Amber?
Hello.
Hi.
You know, a lot of my inspiration comes from the material that I use. You know, in a way, my work is kind of about the hunt for the material. You know, most of the glass that I use is a second life glass. So the primary, what makes up the bulk of my work is old cullet from factories that have now shut down, old pressed glass manufacturers. So what I do is I find this cullet usually at like scrap yards, glass scrap yards. And then I basically take that, melt it, reform it into my own shapes. And then I basically find original pieces that were made in that color. So that kind of hunt for the material and for those special shapes that then I incorporate into the work. The hunt and the find for those pieces is really important to me. And, you know, sometimes now even like strangers will send me stuff. You know, they'll say, I had this thing, it was my mother's, it's broken, could you use it? So I kind of like collect and have this hide and seek for materials. But as far as the themes, you know, travel, things I'm dealing with in my own life, as far as like my more like story forward pieces, those are more personal. So it's kind of a combination of those things.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stay in this order. So Luam, I'm going to circle back to you. And as I ask this next question, I'm going to cycle through some of the imagery from the show so that we can see some of your work layered in with what you're telling us about your work. So Luam, tell me your hopes and dreams with your artistic practice.
So my work is a lot about empathy, about using objects as vehicles for empathetic connection so that the viewer can connect with not only what I'm feeling, but with a more universal feeling that everybody can kind of relate to. So with the furniture, it's a lot to explain because there hasn't been a background on my work yet. But basically with my textile works, like I take an emotion and I turn it into an object based on like the material associations that are connected to how people are going to think about that object based on their own experience with those materials. And so with my furniture work, I'm more directly facilitating social interactions through new approaches to how the body interacts with an object and therefore how bodies interact with each other, with other bodies. So this is my aspiration, is for people to see my work and to sort of to feel something and to think, how can objects that I already have, that I already use, facilitate other forms of social interaction, or just like give me access to my memories, give me access to the things that are valuable to me. And with this series in particular, I was thinking a lot about post-war design and the aspirations of that time, about how you reach the masses in a more positive way and design as problem solving. So with this work, like my aspiration is like, even though I can't reach the masses, at least if people get like the seed in their brain of like, oh, like actually I could use furniture in a way that's better for eye contact, or just looking at the person that's like in my house that I'm interacting with on a regular basis, because those are the people you take the most for granted, and also the people that you need the most from. And so even if you can't afford my chair, you don't have my chair, maybe there's a way to rearrange furniture that you already have in your life that makes for a better way of living. And I live that way. I mean, I don't live with objects. I don't live with that many objects that I've designed, but I do live in this sort of flexible design lifestyle that like makes it easier for me to adapt my space to other people's, or to my needs as they change, as other people come over, or whatever the case may be. So those are my aspirations for how we can live better with objects.
Great, I love that. Ashwini, what about you? What are your hopes and dreams for your practice?
Just to chime in with Luam, I felt so connected with the images I saw on her website. I sent her an email last night. Her work is new to me. In the last few years, my work has been so much about mapping and remapping, trying to understand the ecology of California. I hope to share my practice with the larger world and to contribute in creating an awareness about climate change and about species mutuality. Scientific data can influence some people, but I do believe that art can do more. I also hope that my practice generates an emotional response in viewers and evokes their curiosity and empathy.
That's great. Thank you so much. Amber, what about you?
Oh, there we go. Okay. I was thinking about this question, like what ultimately I would like my work to do. And I thought about an experience this summer when I went up to Dia Beacon, and Dia Beacon's one of my favorite museums, and in particular because of the Agnes Martin room. And I love her paintings. They're greatly inspiring to me. And I, went into the museum, went directly to where that room should be, and they were gone. They just weren't there, and I was like heartbroken. It was like trying to go visit an old friend that wasn't there. And I think ultimately I would like my work to be that, that kind of favorite piece for someone that you could like keep coming back to and finding new things in it to look at, and being like ultimately just being someone's favorite. As far as like greater goals, I'm very much invested in glass. I love glass, and I'm proud of my material. My work is about the history of my material, but I guess like ultimately I would hope that my work could transcend that and like be looked at in like a greater context of the fine art world, even though it's about glass and glass based. So
I love that. I'm going to stick with you for this next one, Amber. So I find that artists often explore characteristics that determine personal and social identity. They construct a sense of who we are as individuals, as a society, or a nation. Sometimes, stereotypes come up, they're questioned. What part of your own identity shows up in your work?
I think my work is like unapologetically feminine and beautiful and sensual. I think there was a while there when like it was kind of artwork that was beautiful was kind of not thought of as interesting or thoughtful or conceptual. And I don't think you could look at my work and not know that it was made by a woman. And I'm okay with that, it's an identity of me, and it shows in my work. And I'm okay with that. I guess that's.
I love that. What about you, Luam? Can you take that question as well? What part of your identity shows up in your work? And it can be everything from heritage, sexuality, race, gender. You tell me.
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting because I sort of mask my identity in my work. I start in a place that's like really about something very directly personal about myself, and I try to abstract it to the point where it becomes a universal experience, something that's like much more something that's relatable, that the most people will be able to relate to. Part of that is because I'm a deeply private person and my work is very emotional. And so part of that is sort of like a buffer for me to like not have my life be like on display. But in another way, it's also so that people who are not me or not like me can find a way that they realize that they are like me, or to feel an emotion that's something that we all experience, because ultimately, like, we're all human beings and we have a lot more in common than we think we do. And that's sort of what my work is about, is like tapping into this like universal sort of experience. Like even the things that I'm interested in, like architecture, furniture, textiles, those are all like ancient practices that are so essential to humanity that there's really like no point in identifying a specific group of people working with textile traditions, because everything is kind of related and intertwined in a way. And so, but of course, like, it's my work, I'm a person, I have an identity. So the things that I gravitate towards, the things that I'm interested in, I think are where my identity comes through. Like, you know, I know a lot about the Western canon in terms of psychology and philosophy particularly, and especially design history, which I'm very interested in. But like, there are certain things about my experience that are brought into the work. Like, I'm interested in like non-Western Indigenous forms of philosophy as like a sort of counterpoint to like the Western philosophy traditions that I've learned. I'm African, you know, of African heritage, and that's part of where I draw experience from. Yeah, I'm a woman, but like a lot of people say, oh, you're a weaver because you're a woman. And I'm like, not necessarily. I mean, it's like all people practice it. It's not necessarily a gendered tradition. So yeah, so I have this sort of complex relationship with identity and non-identity, or some kind of universal identity that I'm trying to tap into.
I love this idea of universal identity and the way in which you can bring the viewer into the work without an idea of the maker. There's something really super interesting there. Thank you. Ashwini, can you answer that as well? What part of your own identity shows up in your work?
I forgot to unmute myself in the beginning.
No worries.
I think it's impossible not to be conscious about gender issues if you are a woman in India, and it's impossible not to be conscious of race if you are a person of color and an immigrant in America. My work is definitely becoming more and more personal in nature. I'm also interested in expanding the way we think about identity by connecting it to thoughts about interdependency. I see my own identity in relationship with others, to other humans and non-humans. The work I'm currently making is highly influenced by the metaphor of the rhizome and by contemporary mycological studies. I keep coming back to one basic question about what would singular identity even mean if we are composed of innumerable organisms, if our DNA contains DNA from other species long ago incorporated into our system. I somehow come back to that question the more and more I come back to my studio.
I love that. Amber, I'm going to switch over and talk just directly about the work. Your work addresses loss of an industry. How do you feel your art addresses those losses, or does it?
Well, I think that it can, if you want to look deeper at the pieces and the material that I'm using. Part of what I talk about with the loss of an industry is that in the mid 1800s through the 1900s, glassmaking was a major industry in this country. It employed entire towns. Boston and Sandwich Glass Factory in New England employed an entire town of people. And nowadays there's really only one real press glass factory manufacturer in the country. So, and a lot of that was, you know, this press glass manufacturing, which is the material that I kind of find and use and reuse in my work. So, you know, I reuse this material and manipulate it. And sometimes you can see the remains of that in the textures and the patterns that come with it. Sometimes more in certain pieces than others. But I think that, you know, people do like recognize these things when they look at my work, if they're, you know, looking for that patterning. I had a piece at the Philadelphia airport that was in a case there for a little while. And it was like these little like dishes that I had redone and kind of like patterned and thinged. And I got this like very little like brief email. It was like couple lines. And it was just like, he said, I saw that piece at the airport. I remember those ice cream dishes my parents or my grandparents used to serve me ice cream sundaes in when he was a little boy. And he said he hadn't thought about that memory in like 40 years. And it was like, you know, something that connected him to this object that has now like run its course. Like the glass, that kind of glass is out of fashion. No one wants it anymore. So I think in a way that's how I can kind of connect my work to that loss, I guess.
What a gift, though, for him and for you to have that.
Yeah, it was a really nice little email. You know?
I love that.
Yeah.
So since we're talking about materials, Luam, your materials are quite unique. Where did the idea to use industrial materials come to play in your work?
Well, so actually it's a good segue from what Amber just said into what I'm about to say, which Perfect. Is, yeah, that like, I'm interested in recontextualizing materials, just as Amber's anecdote just described of, you know, that people have these memories that are connected to materials they've seen or objects that they've seen, and you can access those memories by pulling them into a different context. So the easy answer to your question is that for the last 5 years, I've been a materials specialist in architecture and design. And before that, I had tried many different craft disciplines before I arrived at the language and the mediums that I'm working in now. But one thing that I'm really interested in is industrial manufacturing also. And all of the materials that come out of the engineering and the handwork of like so many individuals that get no credit for that, and all of the properties that are you know, apparent in the materials because they serve a specific function. So personally, I have an interest in that, in learning about that. But one thing that I've found is that people absorb like information about materials just from moving through space. I mean, most of our lives are experienced indoors, and there's so many materials just like in every single interior that like maybe people don't process or think about, but that information of where they've seen it lives somewhere in their brain. And so my goal is to access those parts of the brain, the subconscious, where people recognize something but don't quite understand what it is or why they see it where they see it. I'll tell you something briefly. I did a residency at the Museum of Arts and Design when I set up these psychological experiments with the visitors that came to the museum. And I put a bunch of materials in these little boxes. And I said, if you could tell me a story using those materials as inspiration, what would your story be about? And of course, I had a specific theme in mind, a certain set of emotions that I wanted to, you know, unlock in them. And almost every single time someone gave me like a real answer, it was connected to that theme, but it was a deeply personal anecdote about their own lives that theme reminded them of subconsciously. So tapping into that is really important to me, and that's why I work with a lot of different materials. I think really hard about what story do these materials tell when they're woven together, when you see them together, like what little bits of information help you form a pattern, and what does that pattern look like to other people. So that's why I use a lot of different materials in my work, because the materials really convey the meaning.
Thank you for that. Since we're talking about materials, Ashwini, I want to talk about a different type of material. It seems that the body, the natural and affected elements from fire, you spoke about climate change, are all embedded into your work. How do these concepts interact, and how does this conversation move beyond you to make change?
That's a beautiful question, Laura. Thanks.
We're getting deep here.
My Assembling California series began because I was trying to better understand the land I'm now calling home. My people are called Havyaks. The name literally means those who worship the fire. As in rituals. They were also agriculturists. For the first 10 to 12 years of my clay career, I fired mostly Anagama wood kilns, in which fire again plays an important role, not just as a fuel, it's almost like a ritual too. But once I decided to grow roots here in California, I had to kind of establish a new relationship with the fire. My partner, Forrest, and I, we put up a map of Northern California in our garage, and we started traveling. For some of the travels, we teamed up with a group of biologists, filmmakers, and poets, documenting species re-inhabiting post-fire forests. These torch land where most of the trees look like dead trees turned out to be rich breeding grounds for several endangered species. I definitely see this body of work as talking about both loss and regeneration. California has become not just an influence, but also the wellspring. I also feel that at this critical moment in our time, we need to hear from a chorus of voices, not just scientists, but artists, playwrights, about animals, trees, a tree stump, before our culture is ready to adjust in its short-term thinking about climate change. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that answer. And it's really nice hearing about the layers of your background, as well as your current exploration and research of travel and material from the earth. Amber, this is a bit of a shift, but in your diorama-inspired works, do you visually see this work in your mind prior to sketching or working? How much flows through you? How much do you pre-plan? Or is it all about the luck of the glass find?
You know, a lot of it's about the luck of the find, but it's also like sometimes I search for certain objects. You know, for the piece in the show, I had this idea for a while about I just got stuck on this idea of those old-fashioned Tunnel of Love carnival ride, and I had the wanted to make that piece for so long, and I didn't, you know, how I thought about it and then how it came out is kind of a little bit different, I guess. And this is kind of about like the self-investigation, I guess, in the work as well, and the symbolism. But when I thought about that old carnival ride where these swans just kind of keep going around in a circle, and then I knew that I wanted to have the element of them coming out of this mountain, like one after the other. And then it turned out the girl who she's kind of like laying back in this bath, like luxuriating in like these bubbles, has her head facing away from the swans. And how it turned out in reality was that these swans come out of this mountain full of like these hope bubbles, and then little do they know they're about to like plummet off of this cliff of this waterfall. So, I think that piece kind of speaks about like maybe the vulnerability and the naivety of maybe love or falling in love. But that piece, I had kind of had a vague idea of how I wanted it, but the whole waterfall cliff thing was something that just happened. And I'm happy with that. But those are like the surprises that sometimes happen. I don't draw anything. I'm not a two-dimensional artist at all. So when I do sketches, it's all like three-dimensional mock-ups and things like that.
That's great. Thank you for that. Luam, I want to talk a little bit about the exhibition. Why was it important for you to be a part of Objects 2020? How did that come about?
Well, it's important because it's an important show. It's an amazing show. A lot of my heroes are in it. And, I pull from a lot of different sources for inspiration, and some of my sources of inspiration are in that show. So yeah, it's incredible to be in it, partly because like I am committed to craft as a discipline, broadly speaking, and this is a show that's about craft. So yeah, Glenn Adamson contacted me about being in it, and I didn't know who else was going to be in it, but I assumed that it was going to be at this caliber, and I'm glad that it was.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Ashwini, if you could answer that same question about the exhibition, and then I'm going to do a quick follow-up with you on another question regarding the work.
Luam kind of covered most of the things. I could chime in with similar reasons, but well, to share the space as a woman artist and as an immigrant with all these amazing historical and contemporary artists, that is everything. Before I moved here, a well-known curator from New York had told me that I will never make it here because I don't have pedigree. I understand how the conventional notions of pedigree can be useful. In ceramics, you usually go to RISD for undergrad, and then you go to Alfred for postgrad. In India, people ask you your last name kind of immediately to put you in a box. And here the question is among the artists, usually, which school did you go to? Objects USA placed my work in a larger context. I'm grateful for Glenn Adamson for not only including my work, but also for seeing the connections in my work with the California landscape and with California clay movement. Yeah.
Well, that's a perfect segue into your work. How do the concepts of dance and movement influence the scale and medium of your work? Ashwini.
Yeah. Whether I'm working with an intimate scale or a larger scale, I'm often taking a role of a choreographer. I'm always thinking about the relationship between the positive and the negative spaces around an object as well as its relationship to the object. It's almost like imagining human bodies on stage to observe what happens when they interact. For example, my piece in the Objects USA show is inspired by Estero Trail, which is in Point Reyes, California. The first time I hiked this trail, it was summer, and there were these bright yellow, orange wildflowers on the trail. When I reached the top, I could see this beautiful estuary where the fresh water meets the salty seawater. It was low tide, and all you could see from far are these bulging mounds of dark mud and these natural wave-like patterns. And I had this sudden desire to get under that earth's layer. Now, how do I compose this into a form? How do I catch some of the feelings and transfer it into an object? A dancer uses her own body if she wants to compose a scene inspired from this, while I use clay body. Quite often, I also choreograph still images of finished objects in relationship to my body. I'm looking for a gesture to emphasize our mutuality. Now, after about 15 years of leaving my dance profession, I have started choreographing movement segments where my body is much more of an active participant and an equal partner with the clay body. And in this process, I'm learning new things about my own body.
Yeah, I love that. Amber, what does it mean to you to be a part of Objects USA 2020? And then I'm going to follow up with an art question.
Okay. Well, I think, I knew that when I saw Glenn and R & Company putting on this show, it was going to be a big deal. So I'm really appreciative of being in the show. Obviously some of my glass heroes, I love Richard Marquis's work. Harvey Littleton was in the original show, who's like the, father of American studio glass. But I don't think, I was actually just looking over the list again before we had the talk, and I don't think there was any female women glass artists in the original show. And correct me if I'm wrong, but glass has come a long way since this show as far as representation. And I see that in the work in shows and galleries and in the faculty and student bodies in university programs. So there's definitely a shift. We primarily have female students now in our program. So comparatively to the first show, things have really changed a lot. So I definitely feel proud to be, part of the female representation in the contemporary version.
I love that. And speaking of female representation, I love seeing everyone here that all are female identified. It's really nice in a design conversation. And I'm so appreciative of R & Company for bringing us all together today. Amber, you also speak of symbolism in the mundane in your work and the vulnerability of self-investigation. What does your work teach you about yourself, and how does it push you to learn?
I think that maybe that story I just told about the piece that's in the show kind of talks about that a little bit. I think a lot of like my more narrative story like pieces, I start off with an idea, but then I end up kind of like figuring something out with it, you know, maybe something I'm dealing with personally. It's kind of funny because I made this piece this summer called Hen Collecting All of Her Ova, and it was like this glass chicken that, or hen that, you know, it's a very common theme in this old press glass. And she was kind of sitting in this dish, just overflowing with these I call them pearls, but they're like eggs. And, you know, I kind of saw this as like my idea of me like coming to an age and kind of deciding that I really don't want children. But then the comments that I was getting on it when I put it out there were, someone was commenting that it was broody, that it was like looking like I, you know, was wanting that, when I'm really, it was the opposite. It's just, it's kind of funny. It's like you have an idea about the symbolism that you're putting it on yourself, or you're putting it on your own work. And then, you know, once it goes out in the world, it's like you try your hardest to get that point across, and sometimes your own symbolism in your own everyday, the things that you assign meaning or assign, you know, a certain context to, isn't always the same that someone else assigns that context to. So
I feel like viewing art and design tends to be like transference in psychology at times. It's so much about what the viewer is experiencing at that point. So I appreciate that a lot, by the way. Luam, when did you know you wanted to be, or knew that you were an artist? And was there a living artist that moved you to create?
Yeah, I sort of just always knew that I was inclined towards it. Like even in kindergarten, I was better at drawing than everybody else, and I didn't know why. I like introduced my cohort to the idea of perspective in kindergarten, and it blew everybody's mind. So my lifelong struggle has been finding my medium, because I'm interested in so many things. So like I started doing painting and felt like I was technically good at it, but I had nothing to say. Then I thought, well, maybe if I did architecture, it's like drawing, it's like, you know, but then it was just too big. So I sort of like went through this whole process of trying to find the best way to express myself. So it wasn't like that I didn't know I was an artist. It was, how can I best be an artist? I studied a lot of crafts. I studied Japanese wood joinery. I was making this really crazy knitwear for a while. I'd always been interested in fashion. So all of these experiences like ultimately like led me towards weaving and furniture design, partly because I had experienced the things that I liked about those things through other people's work. Definitely the Bauhaus was a huge inspiration early on. Just the idea that you could, like, if you had a sense of conceptual design, you could apply it to many different mediums. And that really spoke to me because I was trying to find my medium. And of course, architecture, furniture, and textiles are all Bauhaus traditions. So the Bauhaus weavers were a huge inspiration. Later, I encountered Olga de Amaral and Sheila Hicks's work. And Olga de Amaral uses the surface of her textiles, while Sheila, you know, works in many different forms. Sheila is in the show, the Objects USA 2020 show, and the original show. And that was the first time I had experienced textiles as a form of sculpture making. And that was a huge revelation for me. So yeah, I studied textiles at FIT, which is a very professional way of learning textiles. It's like how to be a weaver for commercial manufacturing. So I learned like actually a lot of skills that my work doesn't necessarily reflect, because I sort of break the rules in the way that I work with textiles. So all of these experiences with different crafts, with different craft traditions and like different fields informed the way that I work, which is very interdisciplinary. And later, when I moved to New York, I learned a lot more about contemporary furniture design. I had a pretty strong background in understanding modernist history of design. And yeah, Paul Johnson had started showing Max Lamb's work, and Max Lamb's work was very materials research oriented, which was also inspiring to me to see that kind of work and to see someone finding a way to access furniture design as an individual studio maker who wasn't necessarily locked into a particular material, which is not something that I necessarily want to do. Like, I like the variety a lot, and that's the creative process for me, is like finding a new material to work with, finding a new way to like manipulate the loom so that I will accept that material, finding different ways of thinking about all the dimensions, especially to weaving, of like the surface, the structure, the materiality, like all of those elements. There's like a lot of room for innovation when you break down these individual parts. So my process is still evolving as an artist, of course. I mean, I haven't been doing this that long in the language that I'm working now, and it continues to evolve. So that's my artistic journey in a nutshell, basically.
That's super great. Ashwini, what about you? When did you know you wanted to be an artist or were an artist? And also after that, if you can tell us who you hope to inspire.
Well, while I now live in the Bay Area, I grew up in a small rural South Indian town. You won't even find it on the map unless you are looking for it. I started speaking English mostly in my 20s. I got to experience the world through books and translations. So I wanted to be a writer, a poet. Then when I was 9 years old, I discovered dance. And both dance and play are so rooted and connected to caste system and patriarchy in India. I'm the first full-time artist in my family. And in some sense, my mom and my older sisters and my late father were the first true feminists in my life who supported my vision of being an artist, even when they didn't have a vocabulary to understand what I was seeking. I want to inspire a younger generation of South Asian immigrants who may lack the pedigree, but have the resilience to continue making art. I would also like to inspire viewers, people who seek a deeper meaning or connection with their land or their surroundings. Yeah.
That's super great. I'm going to ask this of everyone because I think it's a really fun question. Amber, can you tell us what your dream project would be, or at least your dream project now?
Oh, a dream project. Well, I think, if I could have like a couple furnaces of this color that I use, and I've been collecting these old press molds, and I have about like maybe a dozen now, but there are places where there are more. A lot of them are like very rusty and falling into disrepair. They're really heavy, they're hard to like move around, but they'll last forever if you take care of them. But I think a dream would be to have a bunch of color pots of the color that I use, and a bunch of these old press molds that I could just like crank out. I know that that's like kind of a pretty technical approach to that dream.
Oh, that's great.
Like technical, like as craft artists, I think we always have to like the technical aspects of our work is something that it can make a break or piece, but also just making bigger, more narrative sculptures. pieces that, wall size piece that's like my, my work.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's interesting. You all talk about the technical side, the material side, but there's a real emotional, personal side to all of this, even though like you're all driven from this personal underneath all the technical. And I think that's super interesting. And it definitely shows in the work. Luam, what is your dream project?
Well, I have a lot of dream projects. I'll tell you the ones that are at the top of the list. I think one would be to do a total environment like the modernist architects did, where they designed the furniture, they designed, the decorative objects, and they designed everything basically. I would love to do a total environment that's like more socially healthy, that encourages like healthy social interactions, because I do think like we need to rethink how interior design, like the models of interior design, they are outdated for this 20th century, 21st century that we're living in many ways. Another dream project of mine is to make design more accessible to people in some way. I have this idea of like a IKEA mom and pop of like a store that's like a community center basically, where I would receive efficient designs that I could make easily from design students or people who are early in their careers, and they could take a commission or whatever, and like we're making stuff that like regular people can buy. The feasibility of that is like impossible, but that's why it's a dream. But a total, yeah, maybe not, maybe in the future, but a total environment would be really exciting. I also like to work at different scales. I did do some designs for mass production, which haven't come out yet. And I really like the idea of doing design for mass production.
Great, thank you. Ashwini, what about you? What's your dream project?
I do have too many to list, but because I've been working in this Assembling California series for a while, it's now kind of evolving into a large body of work comprised of sculptures, watercolors, photos, performance videos. So I'm thinking in a few years, I would love to see what my assemblage looks like. I'm imagining it as a large installation where viewers are able to saunter along, experiencing the interaction of forms, which tell the stories of various fires, trails, trees, animals, and the complex geology of California.
I love that. Now we're going to talk a little bit with the remaining time about both contemporary and historical influences, and also if any of the artists in the exhibition Objects USA 2020 have influenced your work. Amber, I'm going to start with you. Historical influences.
Yeah, I'm actually mostly inspired by more recently by like female painters, surrealist painters. I really love the work of Gertrude Abercrombie, Agnes Pelton, Hilma A.F. Clint, Agnes Martin. And so I actually take a lot of influence and inspiration from these painters, particularly Gertrude Abercrombie. When I found her work, it was almost uncanny how we were both using like the same symbols in our work. Like we were both using like this lone female character, the nautilus shell, the snail, the cat. Like it was like my mind was kind of blown. We were both had this kind of same like language in a way, and she was like making work so long ago. But as far as the show, I mean, I really love the work of Richard Marquis, and I got to visit the show a couple weeks ago, and seeing that like his acid capsule in person, like that piece is so iconic that like seeing it in person instead of just in an image was like magical. So
I love when that work has the ability to move you. And there's so many pieces in this show that I felt moved me as well. Ashwini, what about you? Tell me about some of your either historical or contemporary influences, and if any of the artists in the exhibition have influenced your work.
So many. What I love about Objects USA, both old and new, is that instead of factionalizing different craft practices, it gave an objective, neutral platform to all makers. I want to mention that I discovered Margaret Wildenhain's work and Sheila Hicks's work through the first Objects USA book, which I had with me for all my nomadic clay years. I lived out of 2 suitcases, and this book was definitely one of the books I carried to all the residencies with me. Wildenhain's use of the word live form, referring to a moment in time when a spout is added to the form. There's a beautiful image of how she adds that lip, changed the way I looked at the lip of a pot forever. I love Sheila Hicks's works. The way she makes these organic forms look so sensual and muscular. She is going to be in conversation for the Design and Dialogue pretty soon, and I'm eagerly waiting for that. So yeah, these artists' works and their lives continue to influence me.
Great. And what about you, Luam?
Yeah, well, I mentioned some of the weavers that are in the show. Sheila Hicks definitely is one of my inspirations, and many weavers of that time, because that was such a fertile period when she first came out in the 60s and 70s, around the time of the original Objects USA show. But I'm also inspired by painters, actually quite inspired by painters. Agnes Martin is also one of my influences, as Amber mentioned, because of the way that she abstracts the real world into a more emotional state, something that's like more raw than something that's pictorial. I also love Eva Hessa, the sculptor, who investigates materiality and sort of finds the emotional content within materials in a way that I think is really unique to her practice, and also sort of feminine insertion into this conceptual art landscape, which is extremely masculine. And I think that her work is a big influence on me. I also love Alberto Buri, who also is a painter, and his work is also tapping into trauma and the sort of raw side of emotions, and using materials that are familiar, because he used plastics, used burlap, used in addition to paint, and that sort of mixed media approach really interests me. But a lot of the artists in the original Objects USA were inspiring to me. I mean, I like Ron Nagel, Ken Price, the ceramicists in there, that I look to them often when I'm looking for colors. Same with Mark Rothko. I take colors from those palettes when I'm thinking about, how I'm going to have different colors interact in a piece. I mean, some people are just such brilliant colorists that, why do the work when a brilliant mind has already done it? Sort of my approach.
Yeah,
but no, the original show is just so full of stars in many different fields. So I mean, you could kind of point to many of them and say that's an influence in some way for me.
Thank you. So this question came in from an attendee, and it also overlaps with one of our questions. So I'm going to ask this of everyone, and I'll start with you, Luam, since we left off with you. How important is craftsmanship to you and making your work by hand?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. It's an interesting question because I actually learned in terms of weaving, I learned a lot in terms of the things that make a weaver virtuosic are mostly, I think, the structure and how well you're able to manipulate the structure of weaving in order to create really complex weaves. And for me, that, I've sort of abandoned all of my knowledge of that and sort of just instead worked with the materials in order to place them inside of the work, which is sometimes really challenging because the loom is not really made for some of the things that I put in it. So manipulating the loom is important to me, but actually like the sort of virtuosic side of weaving, of like incorporating many complex structures and all that, is something I've sort of left behind. So in a way you could say that I've sort of abandoned the sort of tenets of that craft, but actually I'm just trying to accomplish something else. So most of my work like is actually on a really simple loom, and it's a loom that like relates to the sort of, it kind of relates to a backstrap loom, which is what a lot of indigenous weavers have been using for thousands of years, especially in like Central and South America. Indigenous weaving methods and indigenous approaches to textiles also are a big influence on me. So basically, I use a simple loom in order to do a manipulation, which is what those weavers were doing in order to accomplish more. They were doing it in order to accomplish more diverse structures, more complex structures, but I'm, I guess in a way, using it for a different form, a different way of creating structure. And in terms of furniture design, I do furniture design under like the worst conditions, basically. I don't have enough space. And like I learned all of these different crafts, but couldn't commit to one. So I work around my lack of knowledge, I guess, in crafts so that I can use a lot of different materials and sort of come in and out and back and forth to them. So yeah, I'm committed to craft, but I also break from it a lot. So that's why I think it's an interesting question to answer.
Great. What about you, Amber? How important is craftsmanship to you and making your work by hand?
It's craftsmanship is really important to me. It's something that I look for in when I appreciate a work of art. I actually use I use a technique that's like a more Venetian traditional style of lamp working or flame working. And most flame workers nowadays are not Venetian lamp workers. It's basically blowing soft glass on the torch. Nowadays, most flame workers use borosilicate glass or like a hard glass, which is kind of technical. But I think that it's not something that you necessarily look at my work and see right offhand. However, the tradition of Venetian flame working or lamp working is something that's very much a dying art. And so it is important for me, to preserve that in my work. But also, with glassmaking, you've got to have tight craft or it's going to break and it's not going to look good. So, there are reasons for it having to be a tight craft as well,
Thank you. What about you, Ashwini?
Mind-body material connection is kind of key to my practice. It took me 2 full years to leave the dance world. Once I wanted to leave it, I thought walking away from it would mean that I wouldn't have any identity. I had to learn it the hard way through injuries. My body made a decision for me. Discovering clay was finding that right material. My hands knew what to do even before I fully understood it. What I have learned as a human and as an artist is that my body is actively involved in my thinking. Yeah.
I love that. We're going to wrap up here, but I have one final question for all of you. So I'm just going to ask the question and then I'll turn to each one of you. So if someone did not know of your work and had never heard of it or seen it, and they discovered your work, what would you want them to come away with? What would you want them to learn about your work? Ashwini, could you take that?
Yeah. I think I want them to be curious about it. That's the first thing which would draw a viewer. If they, when I interact with viewers, if they say, what the heck is this? What is happening here? Those are great questions. Those are conversation starters. Then there is space for dialogue. Yeah, that's what I want them to think about.
Great. Luam, what about you?
I want the viewer to feel something, and I want them to think about why they feel something and why there's potential for materials and objects to make them feel something, and to know that someone else probably felt the same thing in order to make that thing that made them feel something. And I want them, if it's furniture that they're encountering, I would want them to think about what they can do in order to make their own lives a bit better in their own environment at home with their objects and their furniture too.
That's great. And what about you, Amber?
I think a question that I think people approach my work with a lot is like, is that glass? What is that? So once they discover that, it's like just really like finding different moments, like coming back to the work and feeling like they discovered a moment in my work that maybe other people don't see. I always loved like the Where's Waldo books and things like that, where it's like you're constantly finding new things in the work. And that's kind of how I hope my work is for people, that they can kind of always discover something new every time they look at it.
I love that. This has been so informative. I am so lucky to get to learn more about your work and your process. For those of you on the call who have not seen Objects USA 2020, I recommend you get there quick. It's an amazing show, and of course features all of these incredible makers and artists. Thank you to Arn Company. Also, for those of you that don't know about the Female Design Council, please check us out. We support all women in design, and we're thrilled to do so. And I'm just so thankful to have had this talk with you, and I look forward to more. So thank you so much for joining me today. You can all unmute and say whatever you'd like at this point.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Arn Company.
Thank you. This has been so great. And I love getting a peek into all of your spaces. And thank you for joining me and Arn Company this evening. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your night. I look forward to touching base soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.